Hey, Mr. Gronsky here. Today we're going to talk about one of the most important skills for any vocalist singing in a choir, and that is our ability to correctly read a choral score. Now we're going to break this down into three different parts. First, we're going to talk about how do we identify the structure of a choral score. The second part is we're going to talk about the timing of a choral score. And then finally, we're going to talk about how we identify the individual notes or pitches of a choral score. So let's dive right in. If you take a look here on my iPad here, we have a choral score. In this case, we have our title right here at the beginning, Imago Dei. Now, usually on most choral scores, they'll have the title at the top, and then maybe they'll have the composer or maybe even a lyricist over here. In this case, I happen to be the composer and lyricist of this here, of this piece, Imago Dei. But let's dive a little bit deeper here. Now, in the structure of a choral score, we have a system here. Now, this system or a musical system is a group of all of the various instruments in a piece of music. And systems are they're organized with usually with a long bracket here. But if you take a closer look at the system, you can actually see that the vocal parts here in particular are actually, they get their own special bracket, kind of like a vocal bracket here, which organizes and separates the choral parts from the other instruments in this piece of music. So if you were to look at the beginning of a choral score, you can see pretty clearly that all of the vocal parts and the instruments are clearly labeled at the beginning. Now, this is important to point out because as you see more and more choral scores, the specifics of this might change from score to score. In this case, at the very beginning, you're going to see we have all of the parts labeled, but as we scroll through the music, the parts are now gone. And that is usually the case in most choral scores. They will label them at the beginning, and then it's kind of your job to understand which part you are following for the rest of the score. Now, in this case, our vocals, we have soprano 1, soprano 2, and alto. But again, this can change depending on the choral score. There are so many different voices. Even more popular is probably soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. And most choral scores, well, pretty much every choral score, will organize the voicings from highest voicing to lowest voicing. And also you want to pay attention to the different clefs that we have here, right? Because in this case, we all have treble clefs, right? For soprano 1, soprano 2, and alto. But in other choral scores, you may see different clefs, like you might have a bass clef for basses, or for tenors, you might have a treble clef with a little 8 below it that will tell tenors to sing an octave below whatever note is written. But let's keep going here. So we have our vocal parts, which are, again, organized in this little vocal bracket here of our system. And then right below it, we have the piano part. And most choral scores will have piano accompaniment. In this case, we have, again, a grand staff here that consists of a treble clef and a bass clef. But as a vocalist in a choir, you don't really need to pay attention too much to the pianist or to the piano accompaniment, right? There are moments where you do need to count, right? Maybe there's several measures of rests when you're not performing, and it does help to see, oh, okay, I see the piano is playing at this moment, right? So it is helpful to take a look at that. So we have the basic structure here, and the main thing that I've noticed with most of my students tend to get confused with when it comes to reading a choral score is actually following your individual part throughout the course of a choral score. It's very easy to kind of get confused with which musical line you're actually following. So again, let's take a look here, and let's pretend that we are in alto, right? So an alto in this case is actually the 1, 2, 3, the third staff from the top, right? So you want to make note of that because in this system, right, the third staff line is the alto part, and that is going to be the same case for every system. So over here in this second system, this is still the alto part, even though we don't see a label here, right? This whole third staff line is still going to be the alto part. Now, if we were reading this, let's zoom out here for a second. Okay, if we were following this music from the top, that means that we would, and let's use a highlighter here to show us this, we would follow the alto part here, right? We would keep going through this part, and then after this moment, we would go to the second system and follow this set of lyrics and notes. Now, this is super important to point out because probably the most the most popular mistake that I see students make is they think that you need to follow one staff line after the next. But what's incorrect about this is if you were to do that, if you were to follow this staff line and then go to the next staff line, well, actually, you would be reading what? You would be following the soprano 1 part. And then after that, you would be switching to the soprano 2 part. Now, that does not make sense, right? So what you want to make sure that you do is whichever part you are following, you want to follow that specific staff line for the duration of the piece of music, right? So in this case, the alto would follow this line here with these lyrics and notes. And then in the second system, they would again follow that third staff line from the top of the system. And then as we go to the next page, again, the alto is following this part. The alto is always going to be on that same third staff line, 1, 2, 3, that third staff line from the top of the system. And that's why it's important that you understand what a system is and where your part falls in the collection of parts, right? So let's review really quick. So we have our system here, right, which is a collection of all the musical instruments in a piece of music. We have specifically our vocal bracket here, which organizes the vocal part. And then in this case, we have our accompaniment, which is the piano accompaniment. Now, the second part of reading a choral score that we're going to talk about, so first we already talked about the structure of a choral score. The second part is we're going to talk about how do we read the timing of a choral score. And again, this is going to vary depending on the time signature of our choral score or even the style of music that you're performing. You might have a piece of music that has a faster or slower tempo. So let's dive into this piece of music that we have here. The first thing that you probably want to take note of when talking about the timing of a choral score is the time signature. And in this case, we can see, look, every single vocal part and as well as the accompaniment is going to be in the same time signature. And in this case, we are actually in a less common time signature. We are in 6/8 time. Now, I purposely decided to use this example of 6/8 time so that we can really understand the way a time signature works. Now, the top number of a time signature tells us how many beats fit in one measure, right? How many beats fit in one measure? And while we're talking about a measure, it's also important to understand that this whole section here is the whole first measure. This entire space here is the first measure, right? So this is all being performed at the same time. And then this is the second measure being performed. All of these parts performing at the same time, right? And then this would be the third measure, all performing at the same time. And what we're saying is in this entire first measure, we can fit 6 beats, right? And how do we know that we can fit 6 beats in here? Because the top number of our time signature tells us that. Now, the last part that we need to understand about a time signature is the bottom number. And the bottom number tells us what type of note receives 1 beat. And in this case, if you think of it like a fraction, right? Instead of just thinking 6/8, if you think of it almost like 6/8, as if this were a fraction, we're literally saying that an eighth note, a single eighth note, actually gets 1 beat. Now, this is less common because most musicians, probably young student musicians, understand that I thought a quarter note usually gets 1 beat, but that is only because our most common time signature happens to be 4/4. And if we think of it like a fraction, we're basically saying in this case 4 quarters or a quarter note gets 1 beat, right? Now, we're so used to that time signature, but that's the only reason why we think a quarter note usually gets 1 beat. But in 6/8 time, because 8 is on the bottom, that means a single eighth note receives 1 beat. And that is super important for us in terms of following the music, understanding that we have 6 beats per measure, right? Because of this, because of the top number of a time signature, and the bottom number telling us that a single eighth note gets 1 beat. Okay, so we've talked about the structure of a choral score. We've talked now about the timing of a choral score. The last thing to understand about the timing is the tempo of a choral score. And in this case, most tempo markings are written at the beginning or the top of a choral score. And you can almost think of the tempo markings kind of like miles per hour in a car. If you were driving down the highway and you were trying to measure how fast you're going because you don't want to go above the speed limit and get a ticket, right? You would be looking at the odometer, right, which measures, again, the miles per hour of your car. In a similar way, one way to understand of how fast we're progressing through a piece of music is by looking at our tempo marking here. And in this case, this 50 doesn't mean we're going 50 miles per hour, but this means that we are going 50 beats per minute, BPM. So in this case, you can think that a dotted quarter note over here, right, equals 50 beats per minute. Now, most young student musicians, you don't need to pay attention to this too much. This is more for the conductor and the accompanist to get a better understanding of how fast this piece of music should go. You yourself, as the performer, you want to make sure that you're following the conductor or the choir director to make sure that you're lining up with that specific tempo by following their conducting gestures, making sure that you're following for when you're holding out a note or cutting off, making sure that you're following that specific tempo. All right, so we've talked about the structure of a choral score. We've talked about the time of the timing of a choral score. Now, finally, we're going to talk about how do we read the individual notes of a choral score. And to help us out, we're actually going to watch a lesson from 3-Minute Theory. 3-Minute Theory it's just a quick, short 3-minute lesson, and this is really going to break down how do we find individual notes or solfege of a given piece of music. So take a look. Identifying key signatures is one of the most important things that musicians do because key signatures show us what sharps or flats to perform in a given piece of music, and they also show us where do is. Key signatures can contain sharps, or they can contain flats, or they can contain nothing at all, and that's our first rule here. If you don't see any sharps or flats, that means C is do, or in other words, we're in the key of C. So for example, if we had a C right here, and how do we know this is a C? Well, because F-A-C-E, that spells face and it rhymes with space. This C right here is do. That means we're in the key of C. Or if we had a C down here, which has a ledger line through it, this is middle C, this C is also do. This key signature here, that doesn't contain any sharps or flats, tells us that C is our home note, or that it is do, that we are in the key of C. So again, this rule is, if you don't see any sharps or flats, C is do. All right, but what if we have a key signature that does contain sharps? So if we have a key signature like this that contains 2 sharps, for example, well, our rule is a little bit different. The rule is the last sharp is T. The last sharp is T, and this is where solfege comes in handy. The last sharp is going to be the sharp farthest to the right, and this sharp is going to be T. Again, our rule is the last sharp is T. So that means this sharp here is T, and if we go up 1/2 step from here, T, up to here, we now know that this is do. And in this case, what note is this? Well, E, G, B, D, F, right? E, G, B, D, F, E, G, B, D, F, these are the lines of the treble clef. In this case, we know that this note is a D, and we are in the key of D. So the last sharp is T, is going to help us out. Again, the last sharp is farthest to the right. We know that right here is T, and if we go up 1, that is do. So we are in the key of D in this case. But what if we have a key signature that contains flats? It's a different rule. The rule is the last flat is fa. So if we had, let's say, a key signature that has 3 flats, for example, the last flat is going to be farthest to the right, and that means fa is right here. So if we walk it down, fa, mi, re, do, we know that do is going to be on this bottom line. And again, EGBDF, we now know that we are in the key of E flat. This can also work if you were to count up from fa, sol, la, ti, do. You still end up with the same answer because F, A, C, E, right? E, we're in the key of E flat. We still get the same answer because the rule works. The last flat is fa. So let's recap. And also one other trick for this, in case you forget this rule, the last flat is fa. It's an easy way to remember it. Flat, fa. The last flat is fa. So let's recap. If you don't see any sharps or flats, C equals do. For sharps, the last sharp is T. It's the sharp farthest to the right. And for flats, the last flat is fa. The last flat is fa. All right, now that we have a better understanding of how we can find do, let's directly apply this information to this choral score that we've been looking at. So over here, you can see that we already talked about our time signature, right? But let's take a closer look at our key signature. Now, think for a second, which rule are we going to use? Well, this symbol right here is a flat symbol, right? And we just learned that the last flat is fa. So that means fa is actually going to be right here in the middle of this flat symbol. So if we were to trace across, we can see that fa would be on this specific line here. And if we walk it down from that specific line, we can see fa, mi, re. Yep, we are starting on do in this case. All right, so that's an easy way to find what solfege we are following. Now you might be thinking to yourself, why do I need to know what solfege I'm going to be following in a piece of music? Well, solfege is a great way for us to understand how the contour of a melody works or a harmony works. So you can actually follow your individual pitches more accurately if you understand the solfege that you're following. And in this case, we're starting on do. And if we were to just take a quick look here at the rest of the notes for this line, you could see, oh, you know what? We have a lot of do here, right? We are on do here, and this is the same pitch here, do, still do, 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 up. But over here, we go one note up. So one solfege up from do would be re. And then we, oh, looks like we go back to do. But over here, let's take a closer look. If do is here, this is right below do, so this would be T, and then right below that would be la. In any case, once you understand what key you're in, right, by using one of those 3 rules, then you can easily identify the solfege. Now, the more you work on this, the faster you will be able to identify solfege. Now, for beginners, or even through more advanced learners, sometimes it really helps to write in the solfege on a choral score to help you keep track of it. All right, so let's directly apply this information to a sight reading example. Specifically, we're going to take a look at a 70-second solfege example. You're going to hear me guide you through these basic concepts, but what you want to make sure that you do is follow the individual solfege. You're going to have 70 seconds to review this silently by yourself and then perform this sight reading example and then perform it 2 more times at faster tempos. Okay, so try your best, check out this video. All right, let's dive right into our first sight singing example. The first thing we want to take notice of is our key signature here. And we notice we do not have any sharps or flats. For that reason, that means if we don't see any sharps or flats, C is do. So that means we're going to be starting on do. Let's also take notice of the fact that we have some held out notes. And also look out for these changes in direction wherever you see them, okay? Now we're gonna have about 70 seconds to review this. You're starting on do. You wanna tap the tempo and silently go over this, starting now. remember, as you're silently reviewing this, pay attention to those problem areas. Make sure you're thinking about holding out that solfege and watching for those changes in direction with the solfege. Should be plenty of time to go through it in your mind at least 2 times. All right, time is up. We're gonna start on Do. 1, 2, ready, and. We're going to repeat it. Sing it one more time from the beginning. And. Hold out those longer notes. All right, let's have a little fun. Now we're going to speed up the tempo. You're going to sing it again 2 times through. Here we go. Ready? Deep breath. Don't rush. Follow the tempo. Deep breath. All right, final time, even faster, and. Excellent job. Let's review. We've talked about the structure of a choral score. We've talked about how do we identify the timing of a choral score. And finally, we've talked about how we identify the individual notes of a choral score. I hope that this information has helped you. Now, don't forget this information. The next time you take up that choral score, always recognize the structure of the choral score, the timing, and how we identify the individual notes of a choral score. Thanks so much for watching.